Hey everyone! Before we dive into my story, I want to ask you a quick question. What's the one thing someone said that you'll never forget? Let me know in the comments. And if my story touches you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world. Now let's get into it. NTHE, words left his mouth and hung in the air of the hospital room, colder and sharper than the sterile instruments on the tray beside my bed. You're worthless. He didn't shout it. He didn't even raise his voice. He said it with a quiet, chilling finality, the way you'd state a fact, like the sky is blue or the sun has set. And in that moment, the world I had just built, the one filled with the miraculous first cries of my newborn son, shattered into a million pieces. And I had just endured 26 hours of labor, 26 hours of my body tearing itself apart to bring a new soul into this world. My son, Leo, was a perfect tiny miracle, his chest rising and falling in the clear plastic bassinet just a few feet away. I could see the soft fuzz of his dark hair, the miniature perfection of his curled fists. He was everything. He was my everything. NBUT. My husband, Mark, wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me, his eyes devoid of the warmth and pride I had desperately hoped to see. Instead, they held a flat, dead disappointment that cut me deeper than any physical pain I had just experienced. "And I gave you a son," I whispered, my voice a raw, broken thing. I thought that was what he wanted. For years, every conversation about our future, every hopeful late-night talk, had revolved around him having a son to carry on his name, to follow in his footsteps. I had delivered his legacy wrapped in a soft blue blanket. NHE scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound that didn't belong in a room so full of new life. "You gave me a defect," he corrected, his gaze finally flicking to the bassinet with a look of pure disgust. "You think my father will accept this? You think anyone will look at him and see anything other than your failure? Your weakness?" And my blood ran cold. I tried to push myself up, a fire of pure, primal rage trying to ignite in my exhausted body. "Don't you talk about him like that," I managed to say, the words catching in my throat. "He's perfect." Mark took a step closer, his shadow falling over me, blocking the view of our son. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "He has your eyes. Your mother's eyes. The one thing I asked for. The one thing my family prides itself on for generations, are blue eyes, and you couldn't even do that right. You tainted him. You made him worthless." NHE wasn't just talking about our son anymore. He was talking about me. Every insecurity I ever had, every fear that I wasn't good enough for his prestigious, image-obsessed family, was being laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of that maternity ward. The crown of motherhood I had just placed on my head felt like it was tightening, its jewels turning to thorns, its weight becoming a set of chains. A nurse bustled in then, her cheerful smile faltering as she took in the suffocating tension in the room. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Allister?" she asked, her eyes darting between my pale face and Mark's rigid posture. Before I could answer, before I could scream for help, or tell her to get this monster away from me, Mark straightened up, his face transforming in an instant. The cold cruelty vanished, replaced by the charming, concerned mask he wore for the rest of the world. "Everything is fine," he said smoothly, even managing a small, tired smile. "My wife is just overwhelmed. It's been a long day." He turned back to me, and for a split second, the mask slipped. His eyes delivered a silent, brutal warning. "You will say nothing." And I didn't. I lay back against the pillows, my body trembling, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. I had brought life into this world, a beautiful, innocent life, and the man who was supposed to be my partner, my son's protector, had just declared us both worthless. I didn't know it then, but that single, cruel sentence was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the declaration of a war, one never wanted to fight, but one I knew, with chilling certainty, I had to win. For Leo, and for myself. Being in. My marriage to Mark Allister was a fairy tale, or so everyone thought. I met him in my final year of university where I was studying art history and he was finishing his MBA. He was the heir to the Allister fortune, a family that had built an empire on luxury real estate. They were old money, the kind that came with sprawling estates, whispered legends, and an unshakable belief in their own genetic superiority. Their family crest, a golden eagle with piercing sapphire eyes, was a symbol of their power. And their most prized trait, passed down through generations like a royal decree, was their striking, ice blue eyes. It was their brand, their signature, the living proof of their pure bloodline. I, on the other hand, was from a world away. My parents were teachers, my childhood filled with books and laughter, not legacy and lineage. My eyes are a warm, deep brown, the color of rich earth, a trait I inherited from my mother, who was the kindest soul I've ever known. When Mark started pursuing me, I was flattered, but also intimidated. His world was one of polished marble floors and silent, judging portraits of ancestors, all of them staring down with those same unnerving blue eyes. Mark was different, or so I believed. He seemed to love my passion for art, my different perspective. He called my brown eyes captivating and full of warmth. He made me feel seen, not for my pedigree, but for who I was. When he proposed on a yacht under a sky full of stars, presenting me with a ring that held a diamond the size of a robin's egg, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. My parents were hesitant. "Their world is not our world, Elena," my father had warned gently. "Make sure he loves you, not the idea of you." I assured them he did. I was wrong. NTHE first crack appeared on our wedding day. His mother, a formidable woman named Beatrice who moved with the silent grace of a predator, pulled me aside just before the ceremony. She adjusted the veil on my head, her fingers cold against my skin. "Mark has always been a romantic," she said, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as glass. "He sees the best in people. It is a charming quality, but a dangerous one for a man in his position. Your only duty now is to the Allister name. And your most important contribution will be to produce a proper heir. A son with the Allister eyes." It wasn't a piece of advice. It was a command, and I was too swept up in the moment to truly process the threat laced in her words. The first few years of our marriage were a blur of social events, charity galas, and learning to navigate the intricate politics of the Allister clan. I was a doll on display, dressed in designer clothes, my opinions polished and polite, my own passions and dreams slowly fading into the background. Mark was often away on business, and when he was home, he was distant, more concerned with market reports than with me. The easy affection from our courtship was gone, replaced by a cool, possessive ownership. NTHE pressure to get pregnant was immense and unspoken. Beatrice would make comments at family dinners, her gaze lingering on my flat stomach. "A house this large feels so empty without the sound of a child's laughter," she'd say, her blue eyes pinning me in place. When we finally conceived, the entire family celebrated as if a corporate merger had been successfully executed. Mark was suddenly attentive again, but his attention was focused entirely on my womb. He dictated my diet, my exercise, my entire existence. He wasn't caring for me. He was guarding an investment. NHE talked endlessly about our son, mapping out his life before he was even born, which prep school he would attend, which sports he would play, how he would one day take over the company. It was all about legacy, about continuing the perfect, unbroken line. The topic of the Allister eyes came up constantly. It was a bizarre obsession, a cult-like fixation that I found increasingly disturbing. He'd hold up old family portraits, pointing, "Look at my grandfather, my great-grandfather. That is the look of power, Elena. Our son will have that look." And I prayed for a healthy baby. That was my only concern. But deep down, a seed of fear had been planted. What if the baby didn't meet his impossible standards? What if my genes, my common brown-eyed heritage, were seen as a contamination. I pushed the thoughts away, telling myself that the moment he held his child, none of that would matter. A father's love would be stronger than any foolish obsession with eye color. NTHE day of the ultrasound where we could learn the gender, Mark was practically vibrating with excitement. When the technician announced, "It's a boy," he squeezed my hand so tightly it hurt. He was triumphant. He had gotten what he wanted. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe now, things would be okay. Maybe a son would be enough to satisfy them. But as I lay in that hospital bed after Leo was born, listening to Mark's cruel words, I understood the terrifying truth. A son wasn't enough. He had to be the right son. He had to be a perfect copy, a miniature Alistair, untainted by my ordinary blood. In their eyes, my son's beautiful, soulful brown eyes were not a gift from my side of the family. They were a stain, a genetic defect. And I, the vessel that had produced this flawed product, was worthless. The gilded cage I had been living in for years finally slammed shut, its golden bars turning to cold, hard steel. An NTHE journey home from the hospital was a silent, suffocating ordeal. I sat in the back of the chauffeured Bentley, cradling Leo in my arms, his tiny body a warm, solid presence against the cold dread in my heart. Mark sat in the front, staring out the window, the set of his jaw as hard as granite. He hadn't touched his son. He hadn't even looked at him since his outburst in my room. The driver, a man who had been with the family for decades, kept his eyes fixed on the road, but I could feel his pity in the rearview mirror. It made my skin crawl. Our home, a sprawling mansion that had once felt like a palace, now seemed like a prison. As we walked through the grand foyer, Beatrice was there to greet us. She glided towards us, her face a mask of polite inquiry, but her eyes, those piercing blue Alistair eyes, went straight to the bundle in my arms. She peered down at Leo, her smile tightening at the edges for a fraction of a second. It was almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The flicker of disappointment. "Let me see my grandson," she said, her voice a command. NMY arms tightened around Leo instinctively. "He's sleeping," I said, my own voice barely a whisper. NSHE ignored me, gently but firmly pushing back the blanket to get a better look at his face. She stared at him for a long, silent moment. I held my breath. Then she looked up, not at me, but at Mark. Her expression was one of profound, weary disappointment, as if he had failed a critical test. "Nicey," she said softly. She turned and walked away without another word, the click of her heels on the marble floor echoing the sound of my heart breaking all over again. NTHAT was the beginning of the silent war. There were no more overt declarations of my worthlessness. Instead, it was a campaign of psychological warfare, fought with silence, exclusion, and 1,000 tiny cuts. Mark moved into one of the guest suites at the far end of the mansion, citing the baby's crying as a disturbance to his sleep. In reality, he was creating a chasm between us, a physical representation of the emotional one that already existed. NHE treated Leo like a ghost. He would walk into a room where I was feeding or playing with him and act as if the baby wasn't there. He never asked about him, never offered to help, never acknowledged his existence beyond the bare minimum required for public appearances. To the outside world, we were the perfect family. Mark would pose for photos with me and Leo at charity events, his hand resting proprietorially on my shoulder, a hollow smile plastered on his face. But the moment the cameras were gone, the mask would drop, and he would retreat into his cold, silent indifference. Beatrice was the general of this war. She orchestrated my isolation with chilling precision. My friends were subtly pushed away, their invitations to our home regrettably declined due to my demanding schedule as a new mother. My parents were treated with a frosty civility that made them so uncomfortable they began to shorten their visits. Beatrice would critique my every move, her words always cloaked in the guise of helpful advice. "Darling, the baby seems to be crying more than usual. Perhaps your milk isn't rich enough." Or, "Are you sure that outfit is appropriate for an Alistair mother?" "It's a bit." Plain NSHE filled the house with nurses and nannies, not to help me, but to replace me. They were instructed to report everything back to her: how often Leo cried, what I fed him, how I spoke to him. I was being watched, judged, and systematically stripped of my role as a mother. My crown of motherhood was now a crown of thorns, and they were twisting it deeper every day. My only solace was Leo. In the quiet of the nursery, away from the judging eyes of the Allister clan, I could be myself. I would sing to him, tell him stories about my own childhood, and whisper promises into his soft hair. "I love you," I would tell him, over and over again, as if my love alone could build a shield around him to protect him from his own family's poison. "You are perfect. You are more than enough." I was saying the words to him, but I was also saying them to myself, trying to drown out Mark's voice echoing in my head. Worthless and I started to notice things, small but significant details about the Allister Empire. I had always been kept out of the business dealings, treated like a decorative accessory with no intellect for finance. But now, I started listening. I'd overhear snippets of conversations between Mark and his father, hushed phone calls about offshore accounts, and stressed arguments about a problematic investment in South America. I began to read the financial papers that were left on the coffee table, looking up terms I didn't understand, slowly, painstakingly educating myself. I didn't know why I was doing it, not yet. It was just an instinct, a need to arm myself with something, anything that was mine. NTHE turning point came one rainy afternoon. Leo was about 6 months old, and he had a fever. I had been up with him all night, and I was exhausted. I called Mark, who was in his study, my voice trembling with worry. "Mark, his fever is getting worse. I think we need to call the doctor." NHE didn't even look up from his computer. "The nanny can handle it," he said dismissively. "She's not here today, and I'm worried. Please." NHE finally looked at me, his eyes filled with an irritation so profound it stole my breath. "Elena, for God's sake, it's a cold. Stop being so dramatic. You're his mother. Figure it out. That's what you're for." NHE turned back to his screen, dismissing me, dismissing our son's health, dismissing my fear. In that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, decisive click. The part of me that had been hoping he would change, that had been clinging to the memory of the man I thought I married, died. It was gone. And in its place, something new and hard began to form. And I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked out of the study, and called the doctor myself. As I held Leo, rocking him and waiting for the doctor to arrive, I looked around the opulent room, at the priceless art on the walls, the silk curtains, the gilded furniture. It was a beautiful cage, but a cage is still a cage, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would not let my son grow up in it. The silent war was over. My own war was about to begin, and I would not be fighting it with silence. And after that day in the study, the fog of grief and helplessness that had clouded my mind began to clear, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. My new currency was information. My new goal was freedom. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I was an architect, secretly designing my own escape. Brick by painful brick, NMY's first move was to reclaim my son. I dismissed the nannies Beatrice had hired. I did it politely, of course, framing it as my desire to be a more hands-on mother. Beatrice was furious, but she couldn't object without revealing her true motive, which was to control me. It was a small victory, but it was mine. It meant that the eyes and ears of the enemy were no longer in my home 24/7. It gave me space to breathe and, more importantly, space to plan. NMY's second move was to build a secret financial foundation. Mark kept me on a strict allowance, deposited into a joint account that he monitored closely. It was enough for clothes and lunches, but not enough to build a new life on. I had to get creative. I remembered my passion for art history, the one part of my old self that the Allisters hadn't managed to completely extinguish. I started a small, anonymous blog, writing articles and analyses of historical art pieces. It was a risk, but I used public library computers and encrypted connections, covering my tracks meticulously. Slowly, the blog gained a following. I was offered freelance writing gigs for art journals and online galleries. The payments were small at first, but they were mine. I opened a bank account in my maiden name, a digital fortress that Mark knew nothing about. Every dollar I earned was a brick in the wall of my future independence. It was painstaking work, done late at night after Leo was asleep, my face illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen in the dark, silent mansion. I was a ghost in my own home, building a new world while the old one slept. NMY's most important project, however, was Operation Alistair. I began to systematically gather evidence of the family's corruption. My initial eavesdropping had given me a starting point. Now, I became a detective in my own prison. I used my knowledge of the house, my understanding of their routines, my status as the invisible wife, to my advantage. I learned that Mark's study, the one he had dismissed me from, was his command center. He was careless, convinced of his own intellectual superiority over me. He often left documents on his desk or his computer unlocked for brief periods. I would wait until he was in a meeting or out for dinner, then slip in, my heart pounding in my chest. I used my phone to photograph everything: contracts with shell corporations, emails discussing tax evasion strategies, and detailed records of that problematic investment in South America. And it turned out to be a mining operation that was not only financially fraudulent, but was also causing devastating environmental damage and exploiting local workers. The Alistairs were bribing officials to look the other way, all while publicly promoting their company's commitment to, quote, ethical business practices. Their entire empire, their legacy, was built on a foundation of lies, greed, and human suffering. The hypocrisy was staggering, and I saved every piece of evidence to a small, encrypted USB drive, a tiny silver key that held the power to unlock my cage and bring their world crashing down. I kept it hidden in the one place I knew they would never look, inside one of Leo's soft, unassuming teddy bears. The symbol of my son's innocence was now the vessel of his father's destruction. During this time, I reconnected with one of my old university friends, a woman named Sarah, who had gone on to become a fierce investigative journalist. I reached out to her under a pseudonym, feeding her anonymous tips about the Alistair Corporation. I never revealed who I was, but I gave her enough to start digging on her own. I was planting seeds, knowing that when the time was right, they would grow into a forest fire. NMY's relationship with Mark settled into a strange, cold peace. He seemed content with our arrangement. He had his freedom, his business, his affairs. I knew about them, I had found the evidence, but it was just another file in my arsenal, no longer a source of personal pain. He saw me as a defeated, docile wife, a mother absorbed in her child, no longer a threat. He had called me worthless, and now he believed it. It was the biggest mistake he ever made. One evening, he came into the nursery as I was putting Leo to bed. It was a rare occurrence, and it put me on high alert. Leo, now almost 2, looked at him with the wide, curious eyes of a child looking at a stranger. He didn't reach for him. He burrowed closer to me. Mark watched them for a moment, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "He still doesn't have them, you know," he said quietly. The eyes. And I looked up from my son and met his gaze directly. The fear I once felt was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "No," I said, my voice even. "He has his own. And they see everything." NHE didn't understand the double meaning in my words. He just saw a simple woman stating a simple fact. He turned and left, oblivious to the architect, standing in the ruins of her old life, holding the blueprints to his downfall. The final design was nearly complete. All I needed was the right moment to break ground. NNTHE moment came on Leo's 2nd birthday. The Alistairs, ever conscious of their public image, insisted on throwing a lavish party at the estate. It was a grotesque parody of a celebration, a performance for their wealthy friends and business associates. Hundreds of guests wandered through the manicured gardens, sipping champagne and making small talk, while I stood smiling by Mark's side, the perfect wife, the doting mother. Leo, overwhelmed by the noise and the sea of strange faces, was fussy and scared. He clung to me, his small face buried in my dress. Every time someone tried to coo at him or touch him, he would start to cry. I could feel Mark's irritation growing with every whimper. He saw our son's distress not as a normal reaction for a toddler, but as another public embarrassment, another flaw. And the breaking point came during the cake-cutting ceremony. The photographers gathered, their flashes popping. Mark tried to take Leo from my arms for the photo op, but Leo wailed and reached for me, his little hands gripping my necklace. "For God's sake, Elena, control your son," Mark hissed under his breath, his smile never faltering for the cameras. He's scared. I whispered back, trying to soothe Leo, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. That's when Beatrice stepped in. She glided over, her face a mask of grandmotherly concern. "Here, let me try, darling," she said, reaching for Leo. But her touch was cold, her grip too firm. Leo screamed, a raw, terrified sound that cut through the polite chatter of the party. Mark lost it. In front of everyone, his partners, his friends, the photographers, his mask of civility shattered. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh like talons. "Get him out of here," he snarled, his voice low but vibrating with fury. "He's ruining everything." And He wasn't looking at me with anger. He was looking at me with pure hatred. And in that moment, every guest in the vicinity saw it. The polite smiles froze on their faces. A shocked silence fell over the immediate area. The photographers lowered their cameras, their expressions shifting from professional interest to morbid curiosity. They had just seen the real Mark Allister, and I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply looked him dead in the eye, then looked at the faces of the people watching us, searing their shocked expressions into my memory. I gently untangled Mark's fingers from my arm, turned my back on him, and carried my crying son away from the spectacle and back into the house. And as I walked away, I could hear the frantic whispers erupting behind me. I had not created the scene, but I knew with absolute certainty how to use it. This was the catalyst. This was the public crack in the Allister facade that I needed. Later that night, after the last of the guests had departed in a flurry of gossip, Mark stormed into my bedroom. I was sitting in a chair by the window, Leo finally asleep in his crib in the adjoining room. "How dare you?" he seethed, his face pale with rage. "You humiliated me. You and that child." And I stood up slowly, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. The time for silence was over. The time for hiding was over. "No, Mark," I said, my voice calm and clear. "You humiliated yourself. Everyone saw who you really are tonight. The loving father, the devoted husband. It was quite a performance." He took a step towards me, his hand raised. For a second, I thought he was going to strike me. The memory of his words in the hospital, worthless, flashed in my mind, but I did not back down. I held my ground, my gaze unwavering. "You think you have any power here?" He spat. "You are nothing. You have nothing. You are here because I allow you to be here. You will leave with nothing," and I almost smiled. "That's where you're wrong," I said softly. I walked over to Leo's room, retrieved the teddy bear, and pulled the small, silver USB drive from its hidden seam. I held it up between my thumb and forefinger. "I have everything." He stared at the tiny piece of metal, his bravado faltering, a flicker of confusion and fear in his eyes. He didn't understand yet, but he was beginning to. He was beginning to realize that the woman he had dismissed as worthless was the one who held his entire world in the palm of her hand. "The party's over, Mark," I said. "For all of you." And I left him standing there, his face a mixture of rage and dawning horror. I locked my bedroom door, took a deep, shuddering breath, and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. It was time to contact Sarah, the journalist. But this time, I wouldn't be an anonymous source. I would be the architect of the story, and I would attach my name to it. I was ready to burn the gilded cage to the ground. NNTHE next 48 hours were a blur of calculated action. I sent Sarah a single, encrypted email with 2 words: "It's time." Then I packed. Not like a woman fleeing, but like a woman moving on. I took only what was truly ours: my clothes, Leo's things, my personal documents, and the small portfolio of my own artwork that I had hidden away. I left behind the jewels, the designer gowns, the empty symbols of my life as Mrs. Alistair. They were props from a play I was no longer acting in. NMY final act in that house was to walk into the Grand Library, where generations of Alistair portraits hung on the walls, their identical blue eyes staring down with cold arrogance. I took a small, framed photo of my parents from my bag and placed it right in the center of the grand mantelpiece. It was a small act of defiance, a reclamation of my own heritage in the heart of their shrine to genetic purity. I left before dawn, with Leo sleeping peacefully in his car seat. I didn't look back. I drove not to a shelter, but to a modest, clean hotel I had pre-booked with my own money. The first phone call I made was to a lawyer Sarah had recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who specialized in high-conflict divorces. The second was to my parents, who simply said, "We're on our way." NTHE story broke 2 days later. It was an explosion. Sarah's article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, a meticulous and damning exposé of the Alistair Corporation's fraudulent and unethical practices. It was on the front page of a major national newspaper, and it was everywhere online. But it wasn't just about financial corruption. Woven into the narrative of corporate greed was the personal story of the woman who had uncovered it all. My story and I had given Sarah everything: the emails, the bank records, the proof of the environmental damage. But I had also given her my voice. I told her about the obsession with blue eyes, the psychological abuse, the isolation. I told her about Mark's words in the hospital. I told her about Leo's birthday party. I laid the truth bare for the world to see. NTHE fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Alistairs. The stock price of their company plummeted. Federal investigators launched a formal inquiry. Business partners, terrified of being associated with the scandal, pulled out of deals in droves. The name that was once a symbol of power and prestige became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. Mark tried to fight back. He released a statement calling me a liar, a disgruntled wife seeking a larger divorce settlement. But the evidence was irrefutable, and the public, having read the details of his personal cruelty, didn't believe him. The story of the baby with the wrong color eyes was particularly damaging. It was so bizarre, so petty, so monstrously arrogant that it captured the public's imagination. It made him a villain not just in the boardroom, but in the court of public opinion. Beatrice, the untouchable matriarch, was finally touched. Her carefully curated social world crumbled. Charity boards asked for her resignation. Old friends suddenly stopped returning her calls. The shame was something she couldn't bear. For the first time in her life, she was on the outside looking in, and I watched the reckoning unfold from the quiet safety of my new life. My lawyer handled everything, shielding me from the storm. The divorce proceedings were swift. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, Mark had no choice but to settle. He lost his company, his reputation, and a significant portion of his fortune. But I knew his greatest loss was his pride. The legacy he was so obsessed with was now a legacy of disgrace. One afternoon, my lawyer called. "Mark Alistair is asking to see you," she said. "You don't have to, of course. I can refuse." And I thought about it for a long moment. The old me would have been terrified, but I wasn't the old me anymore. "I'll see him," I said, "on my terms." NWE met in a neutral location, the conference room of my lawyer's office. He looked smaller, diminished. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. His expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame. "Now, what do you want, Mark?" I asked. My voice steady, NHE looked at me, and for the first time, I think he truly saw me. Not as a possession, not as a failure, but as the person who had single-handedly dismantled his entire world. "Why?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Why would you do all this?" And I leaned forward slightly. "You asked me that once before, in my hospital room, right after I had given birth to our son. You held up my entire worth and found it lacking. You looked at a perfect, innocent baby and called him a defect. You asked me why? I did it for him. I did it so he would never have to grow up in a house where his value was measured by the color of his eyes. I did it so he would never, ever believe he was worthless. And I stood up. My part in this conversation finished. You built your kingdom on the idea that some people are worth more than others. I said, walking towards the door. You just never imagined that one of your worthless people would be the one to burn it to the ground. And I left him sitting there, a king in a ruined castle of his own making. The reckoning was complete. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been meticulously designed and executed by the architect he had created, one Aaron. And in the aftermath of the storm, there was silence, a beautiful, peaceful, and empowering silence. The world I had built for myself and Leo was small, but it was solid, constructed with the foundations of love, safety, and freedom. We moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, miles away from the cold grandeur of the Allister estate. The sun streamed through our windows in the morning, and the sound of Leo's laughter was the only thing that echoed off the walls. NMY parents were my rock. They moved closer to be with us, their unconditional love, a healing balm on the scars I still carried. My father would spend hours on the floor playing with Leo, teaching him how to build towers with blocks. My mother would hold me while I cried, not for the life I had lost, but for the years I had wasted, believing I wasn't enough. You were always enough, Elena, she would say, her warm brown eyes, the same eyes she had given me and I had given my son, full of love. You just had to see it for yourself. NTHE money from the divorce settlement gave us security, but my independence came from my own work. My art history blog had become my full-time career. I was no longer an anonymous ghostwriter. I was Elena Reyes, my maiden name, a respected voice in the art community. I signed a contract to write a book, a project that filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my university days. I was reclaiming the parts of myself I had been forced to bury. And I was not just surviving, I was thriving. I was rising from the ashes of my old life, not as a victim, but as a phoenix. I learned that my worth was not something that could be given or taken away by someone else. It was inherent. It was in my resilience, my intelligence, my compassion. It was in the fierce, protective love I had for my son. Leo blossomed away from the toxic environment of the Allister mansion. He was a happy, curious, and incredibly bright little boy. He was fearless and kind, quick to laugh and slow to anger. He was everything a parent could ever hope for. One day, when he was about 4 years old, we were sitting in the park, and he looked up at me with his big, beautiful brown eyes. "Mommy," he said, with the serious gravity of a small child, "why are your eyes the same as mine?" And I smiled, my heart swelling with a love so powerful it almost hurt. I tucked a strand of hair behind his ear. "Because you got the very best part of me," I told him.